may recall, if you have been following along all the way through this particular series of audio commentaries, chapter by chapter through the book of Genesis, that we have a time or two stopped to talk and consider a common pattern that we find not just in the book of Genesis, but throughout the Bible. A pattern, a historical pattern that goes like this. We begin in a context of blessing and joy and good, strong, healthy relationship among men and between man and God. And in that place of blessing, over time, what we discover happening is that the people begin to forget their dependence upon the grace of God. They began to look around at their success and think, well, haven't I done such a wonderful job? Aren't I something else? I'm to be envied, and this is my doing. Think of Nebuchadnezzar and his pride. Well, what happens after that is the blessings begin to decrease and the hardships begin to increase until eventually the hardships get so hard that God's people cry out for deliverance. Rescue us, O Lord. They realize, hey, we didn't get to that place of blessing on our own. That was God's doing. That was God's grace. We've turned our back on Him. And now this is what this has led us to, this context of hardship and sorrow. So they cry out, Lord, please deliver us. Show us your grace. And God does, typically sending a rescuer of some sort who rescues God's people and puts them in a place of blessing again, and the whole process starts all over. You can see this beginning in Genesis chapter 1, that God has put Adam and Eve in this great place of blessing, but they have forgotten Him, they've not honored Him, and they fall into sin, and they're now in misery. And eventually we're told about Seth, that God's people, that's when God's people began calling upon the name of the Lord. So we see that process there. We see it in the Exodus, and we see it reaching that return point here in Genesis chapter 46, which is where we're turning our attention today. If you remember last time, Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. He expressed his forgiveness toward them and encouraged them to go back and get all of their family, including Jacob, and to bring them down. We remember that Pharaoh was very positive about this plan and very encouraging of it, and they'd set aside this land of Goshen. Well, what I want to do is compare the circumstances of what's going on just as Joseph's story begins and where we are now in Joseph's story, remembering that it may seem odd to us, but the book of Genesis devotes more space to the life and work of Joseph than anyone else. Isn't that a little odd? This is the book that has Noah in it, the book that has Adam in it, the book that has Abraham in it. And yet here's Joseph hogging all the column space. Well, I think there's a reason for that, one of which is that this is a picture that's designed to show us about the work of Christ. Well, let's get to that situation where we first meet Joseph, where we see now this tension in the relationship among the brothers. This tension is so grave and so serious that Joseph's life is almost lost. In the context of Cain and Abel, it actually happened. Here in this context, the peace in the family is so diminished and so beaten that Joseph is about to be killed, but is instead sold into slavery. And where did that problem come from? Well, one of the complaints that we not only can, but should lay at the feet of Jacob, not surprisingly, because he learned it from his father, is his own propensity to play favorites among his wives and among his children. Joseph was the favored one because of his mother. When Joseph was gone, Benjamin became the favored one because of the same mother. But Jacob has wives. Jacob has concubines. Some of these are better women. Some of these are not as good women. And you have, out of that, again, all of this familial tension. And then you have these sons no longer following the pattern of what their fathers had done. Did you notice that? You remember when Isaac was in need of a bride, the solution was, let's go back to where Abraham came from and let's get one of these relatives to come and be Isaac's wife. Then with Jacob, the plan is essentially the same. Jacob's going to go back to where his people are from and he's going to marry from there. But that he doesn't stop there and takes more wives, and including foreign wives. And now all these 12 sons do the same. So we have a rapid downward decline in the moral standing of God's people. God had made this promise to Abraham. He'd reiterated it to Isaac. He reiterated it to Jacob. And yet now we have this mess. So we've got internal fighting. We have the danger of syncretism and the blending in with foreigners who are not of the faith of Abraham. And we have, in the context that's coming soon anyway, we have a famine in the land where there's a great deal of hunger. Joseph solves all three of these problems. And it begins with and is grounded in his grace toward and forgiveness of his brothers. Everything that has gone wrong is undone, defeated through not Joseph being so powerful, not Joseph being so ruthless, not Joseph being so intelligent, but Joseph being gracious and forgiving. It's because he forgives the brothers that the brothers are reconciled. It's because of this forgiveness and reconciliation that Jacob comes out of the land of Canaan to be with Joseph and the family in the land of Goshen. And it's because of this that they're placed in the land of Goshen, and in God's good providence, as we read about in this chapter, no matter how prosperous they might be, there's not a real danger of a lot of the Egyptian women looking for husbands among the descendants of Jacob. Why is that? Well, because the descendants of Jacob are shepherds. And in God's good providence, the culture that they are near, the foreign culture that they are near, is one that looks down their noses at shepherds. Shepherds are not desirable spouses for the Egyptians. So they're given their own land, a land that's well suited for the work that they do, that is separated from the rest of the Egyptians. And so now that danger has passed, and God prospers them. He gives them blessing and prosperity. I don't want you, and I get the temptation. As I was preparing for this conversation, couldn't help but notice that there's quite a few names listed in this chapter, and I've mentioned before how easy it is and how tempting it is to race through those names. In my time of worship together with my wife every evening. We are going together through the Bible in a year, and are currently in the Old Testament readings, First Chronicles. And my wife enjoys watching me struggle and stumble through difficult to pronounce name after difficult to pronounce name. But I do try to get through them, and I do try to read them well. And you might sort of rush through this section here and lose sight of precisely what we're talking about. To think that this is a sort of unscientific postscript, a brief unpacking of, and they all lived happily ever after. When really what this is trying to do is to show us, to demonstrate for us, how God's people got to this place, going all the way back to Abraham. Remember how one of God's promises to Abraham was that from him would come rulers. Now, how does that happen? It seems for most of us, we have this image of royalty as something that you're born into, and Abraham and his family didn't qualify for that. But we see now in the life of in the life of Joseph, that part of the prophecy to Abraham being fulfilled. It's happening, and it's going to continue to happen, and it's going to happen later on in the life of Moses. But for now, we're in this place of blessing. It's not complete. It's not finished, but in a manner of speaking, we're witnessing a significant percentage of the promises that had been made to Abraham coming to pass. They're in a good land. They're in a safe land. They're in a place of a position of power and authority through Joseph. They are secure. They're getting along with each other, and all of it traces back to the forgiveness that Joseph showed his brothers. If that doesn't make Joseph a type of Christ, I don't know what possibly could. You know, we have talked in the past about sort of pseudo-deaths and resurrections, whether it was Joseph being thrown into the pit by his brothers and then being lifted up, whether it was Joseph being put into the prison and then being lifted out of there. We've talked about Joseph's ascent to this position of authority as like an ascension. So there's all sorts of these kinds of pictures of Jesus in the life of Joseph. But, again, what should grab our attention is that the story pivots and the blessing comes where there is forgiveness. You know, I have argued in this series and just about everywhere I have a chance to that so much of what's wrong with our perspective on the law of God is that we miss out on the glorious truth that God's law is designed for our well-being and for blessing, and that the offense of our sin is not so much, that certainly includes this, but not so much the assault on the dignity of God's authority over us, but the implicit denial of God's kindness toward us. That we look at God's law and say, you don't mean me well. You want to harm me. You're keeping something good from me. And that's why I'm disobeying you, because you're mean. Well, how much more is that the problem when it comes to the positive command that he gives us to forgive others? We think that when we forgive, we're sort of taking one on the chin. We're living sacrificial lives, doing the right thing, even though it's so terribly unpleasant. but we're doing the right thing because we needed to be forgiven, because God commands us to do that, and we owe it to him because he's our maker and our redeemer, and so yes, okay, we will forgive. But like every other bit of God's law, what we discover is that as we obey, we walk into blessing. This is what's happened for Joseph. Joseph isn't endangered by forgiving his brothers. He doesn't have to be fearful of them and get them out of the way so that they don't do it again. I'm sure he missed them. We know he missed Benjamin. We know he missed his father. But out of that forgiveness, they're brought together. They're put in this place of safety. There is no reason to fear. Joseph's in a place where he can honor and protect his father. I think it's prudent for us to stop and to think through what opportunities God might be giving us when it comes to forgiveness. One of the principles that grows out of that principle, whereby I remind you time and again that these people in these stories are not characters in stories, they're people. They're real. Joseph was a guy. And Joseph did not have any super special secret spiritual power that you don't have. And so when you see him doing the right thing, and you see God blessing him, it should make you think, what can I do? Who can I forgive? How can I receive the blessing that Joseph receives? By following in this pattern and being not just like Joseph, but being like Jesus. That's the invitation here in this text. Wouldn't you like to see those loved ones that you are estranged from, that you're in a relationship filled with tension? Wouldn't you love to have that tension go away, to restore the joy of that relationship, and then to see those very people blessed by God? And wouldn't that be a blessing from God for you? We have just a few more chapters left in the book of Genesis. And at this late stage in the game, this is where we are. God's people, secure, safe, provided for, at peace, under God's good hand, being blessed and prospering. And again, all of which came out of the gracious and forgiving heart of Joseph.